Welcome to part 4 of our Link G4x mini training series here. This training tutorial, we're going to be taking a look at working with firmware updating on our G4x box. So the firmware update allows us to have the software communicate with the hardware on the box properly. It's the in-between. Anytime we're doing a new software update from Link, we want to make sure that we're also doing a firmware update, so we're controlling our Link box properly. So we're going to go through that process from start to finish here. Let's jump in so we can check this out. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to be taking a look at how to do a firmware update on our Link G4x system. Now, our firmware is what communicates between the hardware on our G4x and the software. So as Link adds new software updates, maybe they're adding new features or functions within the software to make the G4x more and more capable as a system, we'll have to do a firmware update so the hardware, as we're commanding it to do a particular task, is going to communicate properly with the software and actually carry out the task that the new software is requesting. Now, in order to do a firmware update, it's in a very simple process. We have to be first online with our G4x. So in this case, I'm sitting in my vehicle. I have the ignition key powered on. The engine is off. Very, very key. You cannot do a firmware update with the engine running. You can see the status here under engine RPM. That's going to be 0. We can also see if we're online up at the top here, we can see in this green box showing online. So we're online, we're key on, we're engine off. Now I have just installed the newer version of the software onto my laptop here, and we may or may not have to do a firmware update. We always want to check. Let's take a look. We're going to go up here under ECU controls at the top, go into our drop down, and move here into update firmware. We can see in our firmware updater window here that we have the available firmware here up at the top. We always want to choose the latest firmware that's available here in the drop-down. Typically, it's only going to be one available firmware, but there might be multiple. In this case, it's going to show the ECU firmware matches the update version. There's no need to upgrade from 623.6 to 623.6. So I'm going to just show you the process, because if you are seeing that you have a newer option here, it'll show you that there is a mismatch and you need to actually update the firmware. The steps would be here, going into the read notes first option. It's going to show you all kinds of information and we need to be aware of, specifically for what's changed here in the latest firmware version. And we can see that it's showing here this firmware of 623.6. This is the latest firmware available that's going and adding all of these different options or features or fixes within the software and allowing that hardware to communicate with the software and with the G4x. So what we're going to do here is go into reinstall. Now, you might just have install as your option. I have reinstall because I've already installed the firmware and updated that at a previous point in time, probably about a month or two ago. So it's not going to be showing me the install, but we'll do the same process here. So we'll go to reinstall. It's going to say, have you read the firmware version notes? I have. We just looked at it real quick and we'll say yes. And then it's going to tell me, and it's very important here, that it's going to require us to leave the ignition switch on. Do not power off your Link box when you're doing a firmware update. If you turn the key off, if your battery voltage dies, you have the potential to break your Link, and you might have to send it back to Link in order for them to recover it and repair it so that you can actually do a firmware update and being able to start the process all over again. So you want to make sure that the power source is going to be good for the Link. If you're in question of your battery condition, always hook it up to a battery charger when you're doing your firmware update. Now, the process is very quick in order to complete the firmware update, but we want to make sure that you have a solid power source, and more importantly, you're not interrupting the Link, you're not unplugging the Link, you're not unpowering the Link. Very, very important. Firmware updating is one of those very serious things, and when we're doing it, we do not want to have any potential for failure during the process. So, do you want to continue with the update? I'll say yes, and we'll allow this to do the firmware update. Now, down here at the bottom, we're going to see our status bar here. Now, in my case, it looks like my laptop is kind of bogging down. Sometimes I've noticed it does this on my particular laptop I'm working with here. All of a sudden, it'll tell me that the firmware update has been completed, and we can see now it's actually started. We can see that the status bar down here at the bottom, as soon as it goes all the way across, it means it's completed the firmware update. I have had it where it's frozen before and it's done that whole sweep and then it's completed the process, but it should do exactly what we're finding right here. So we can see the programming is complete and the ECU now is ready to run. We can click OK and we can simply close out of this. We have now completed the firmware update. Now what I like to do, just to be safe, is to actually power off the link and then power it on again. We likely don't have to go through that last step, but it's just something that I've always done with all the computers that I ever do a firmware update on. So I'm going to go ahead and just simply power off my vehicle. We can see it showing searching, and then just do a quick power cycle back on again, and we should find that it connects and we're back online. So completed the firmware update process, and now my software and my hardware will communicate properly with that firmware acting as the go-between in our software, so the features and functions will now work properly and everything will do exactly what I want and I won't have any odd behavior. I will warn you, if you update your software and you don't do a firmware update, you can run into many odd problems. So if you're finding that you've done a software update, let's say you forgot to do a firmware update when you've done the software update, and you're going and tuning and you're noticing that things just aren't working properly. You might find logging values might be kind of off. Or as you're doing your tuning, maybe you're finding that something's going odd with the closed loop, or with the idle control, or with boost control. First thing to check, make sure that firmware is up to date. I ran into this a couple times myself where I just simply forget to do the firmware update and then I do it and everything works out and everything is back to normal again. So it is important that you are checking on the firmware update every time you do a software update. Okay, that's going to wrap it up here. Taking a look at our firmware updating, very simple process. We're going to be moving into the next tutorial, taking a look at data logging, just the basics and getting familiar with that, how to create a data log, how to save it in both the laptop and the onboard logging. All right, that's going to wrap it up here. I'll see you guys now in our next mini training tutorial.